The merchant bid, and everyone laughs at the obese girl until the mountain man said, $100. The winter fair of Dust Valley had drawn every soul within 50 miles. The marketplace sprawled across the frozen ground like a patchwork quilt. Canvas tents flapped in the bitter wind. Smoke curled from dozens of cooking fires, and the constant hum of commerce and conversation filled the mountain air. Vendors hawked everything from furs to flour, from ammunition to broken dreams wrapped in false promises. Among the chaos stood Marcus Thorne, a portly merchant whose greed hung around him like the stench of spoiled meat. His eyes gleamed with the particular cruelty of a man who had convinced himself that the suffering of others was simply the cost of doing business. Today, he was conducting what he euphemistically called labor auctions, selling indentured servants to cover his debts, though everyone knew the debts existed only in his ledgers, carefully doctored to justify theft. The crowd gathered in a loose circle around his makeshift platform, a weathered wooden stage that creaked under the weight of his footsteps. The air was thick with anticipation and the kind of ugly excitement that humans sometimes feel when witnessing the degradation of others. "Next item," Thorne announced, his voice booming across the square. He grabbed a young woman by the wrist and hauled her forward with such force that she stumbled. Her name was Sarah Chen. She was 19 years old, though her eyes held the exhaustion of someone who had lived through a lifetime of hardship. Her body, rounded and soft, had become the subject of ridicule in a world that valued only what could be quantified and sold. Her hair, once fine and black as midnight, hung in matted tangles around her face. Her dress, if the tattered fabric could be called that, hung in strips from her shoulders, and her skin was marked with the gray ash of despair. "Now, this one here," Thorne announced, his meaty hand clamped on her shoulder like a brand, "is a hard worker. Strong back, good hands, excellent at domestic labor, can cook, clean, mend, worth her weight in gold, I'd say." The crowd knew this was a lie. They had seen Sarah being dragged through the marketplace for the past 3 days. They had heard Thorne's constantly changing stories about her origins, each more disparaging than the last. "So what am I bid?" Thorne sneered. "Let's start the bidding at 50 cents. Do I hear 50 cents? 50 cents, came a shout from the crowd. 75, another voice called. The crowd laughed. The laughter was the worst part, not cruel so much as indifferent, the sound of people amusing themselves with the spectacle of someone else's destruction. $1, someone yelled, and the bidding continued, a grotesque competition to see who could humiliate her most efficiently. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the ground. Tears tracked through the grime on her cheeks, but she made no sound. There was a dignity in her silence, an invisible protest against the machinery of her own erasure. The bidding settled at $2.50 when a tall man with cold eyes stepped forward, ready to complete the transaction. But before the merchant could conclude the sale, a new voice cut through the noise, a voice like the cracking of ice on a winter river. $100. The marketplace fell silent. Every head turned toward the source of the voice. Standing at the edge of the crowd was a man who seemed to belong to a different world entirely. He was tall, with the kind of build that spoke of years lived against nature rather than within civilization. His face was weathered to the color of old leather, his beard thick and unkempt, his eyes the shade of winter sky. He wore a coat made from wolf fur, and across his chest hung the kind of practical equipment that marked him as a mountain man, someone who trapped furs, hunted game, and lived in the high peaks where most people feared to venture. This was Jonas Creed. The stories about Jonas Creed were the kind that got told by fires when the wind howled outside. People said he had tracked and killed a grizzly bear with nothing but a knife. People said he had spent 7 winters alone in the mountains without coming down to civilization, and that when he finally did, he had walked into a saloon and broken a man's arm simply for looking at him wrong. People said he didn't speak unless it was absolutely necessary, and that he had never in his life shown interest in another human being. Marcus Thorne's face went pale. $100? You're joking. Jonas didn't smile. I don't joke. But that's... Thorne stammered, genuinely shocked. That's an absurd price for a girl like this. Look at her, I'm aware of what she looks like, Jonas interrupted, his voice soft but carrying the weight of finality. He reached into his coat and produced a leather purse. He counted out the money in bills and coins, each piece struck down on the wooden table with deliberate care. And from this moment forward, she is no longer merchandise. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Jonas removed his wolf fur coat and draped it gently around Sarah's shoulders. His movements were careful, almost tender, in stark contrast to the violence everyone expected from him. He took her hand, not roughly but with surprising gentleness, and began to lead her away from the platform. As they walked through the crowd, people instinctively stepped aside. Some whispered, others simply stared. But no one laughed. The marketplace seemed to have collectively held its breath and found that it had changed the shape of its mouth in the holding. The journey from Dust Valley to Jonas's cabin took 2 days of hard riding through increasingly difficult terrain. Sarah had never ridden a horse before, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest. But she didn't complain. She had learned long ago that complaining didn't change anything, except to mark one as deserving of additional punishment. Jonas spoke very little during the journey. They rode through pine forests so dense that the sunlight seemed to give up trying to penetrate them. They crossed streams that ran so cold they seemed to burn. They climbed higher and higher until the air itself felt thinner, cleaner, as if they were riding toward something better simply through the act of ascending. At night, Jonas built a fire and cooked beans and deer meat. He gave Sarah the larger portion without comment. She tried to refuse, but he simply looked at her, not unkindly, but with absolute firmness, and she understood that refusing would be insulting to something important in him. The cabin appeared on the morning of the 3rd day, nestled in a valley surrounded by peaks that seemed to touch the sky itself. It was small, made of logs that had been carefully selected and cut to fit together with precision. The roof was sound. The door was solid. Smoke rose from the chimney, having been maintained by someone Jonas had apparently arranged to care for it during his absence. "This is home," Jonas said simply. Sarah stepped out of the saddle with shaking legs and looked around. She had never imagined a place like this, somewhere so far removed from the world of towns and commerce and human cruelty. It seemed almost impossible that such quietness could exist. Jonas showed her around the cabin. There were 2 rooms, a main space with a fireplace and cooking area, and a bedroom with a narrow bed and a small shelf of books. There was a stable attached where they could keep the horses. There was a small spring nearby that provided fresh water year-round. "You can sleep in the bedroom," Jonas said. "I'll take the main room." But Sarah started to protest. "It's settled," he said, and something in his tone made it clear that any argument would be futile and perhaps offensive. That first week, Sarah slowly came to understand what her life had become. It was simultaneously the simplest and the most complex thing she had ever experienced. There were no grand expectations placed upon her. She was not expected to be invisible or grateful in a fawning way, or to transform herself into something acceptable to the world. Jonas simply introduced her to the work of the mountain. He taught her how to maintain the fire, how to read the weather in the sky, how to shoot a rifle. He showed her where the animals came to drink and how to move through the forest without disturbing them. He taught her the names of plants, which ones could be eaten, which ones could be used for medicine, which ones would kill you if you were foolish enough to consume them. And in the evenings, when the work was done, he read to her from his small collection of books. He had Cervantes and Shakespeare and volumes of poetry. He read in a low, careful voice, occasionally stumbling over a particularly difficult passage, but never self-conscious about it. Why do you read? Sarah asked one night after he had finished a passage from Romeo and Juliet. Jonas was quiet for a long moment. Because people contain multitudes, he said finally. And books are one way of remembering that. Out here, it's easy to forget that humans are capable of creating beauty. It's good to remember. Tate. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they were different from the tears she had shed in the marketplace. These tears came from something inside her that had been closed off for so long she had forgotten it existed. The seasons turned. Autumn arrived, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah found herself becoming stronger, not just physically, though her body certainly transformed, but in some deeper way that had to do with agency and competence and the quiet assurance that came from understanding your own capabilities. She became skilled at hunting. She learned to tan hides and prepare furs. She began to understand the mountains not as an obstacle or a hostile space, but as a partner in survival, something that had its own logic and patterns that, once understood, could be worked with rather than fought against. And somewhere in this process, something shifted between her and Jonas. It happened gradually, in small moments. The way his eyes would linger on her for an extra beat too long, the way his hand would brush hers when they were reaching for the same thing, and neither of them would pull away immediately. The way he began to consult with her about decisions, valuing her input in a way that suggested he genuinely believed she had something intelligent to contribute. One afternoon in early November, as they were preparing for the deep winter, Jonas came in from checking the stores and found Sarah at the window, looking out at the mountains. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Sarah turned to look at him. "I was thinking about that day in the marketplace," she said quietly, "and how it was supposed to be the end of my story. How I was supposed to be sold to someone who would work me to death, and how instead—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Jonas crossed the room and stood beside her at the window. For a long moment, he didn't speak. "I didn't save you," he said finally, his voice rough. "I want you to understand that. Saving implies that you were broken and that I fixed you. But you weren't broken. You were simply trapped. There's a difference." "Then what did you do?" Sarah asked. "I removed the trap," Jonas said. "But you're the one who walked through the open door. You're the one who learned to shoot and to hunt and to survive. You're the one who chose to build a life here instead of simply existing as a victim of circumstance." Sarah turned to face him fully. In the afternoon light coming through the window, she could see the small scars that marked his face, each one a story of survival and struggle. "I love you," she said simply. Jonas closed his eyes, and for a moment she thought she had made a terrible mistake. But then he opened them again, and she saw in them something that made her breath catch, a kind of wonder mixed with a painful longing. "I love you too," he said. "I think I did from the moment I saw you standing on that platform, and I knew that I would do whatever it took to get you away from there." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "But you need to understand what that means," he continued. "Life out here is hard. There will be winters when we run out of food. There will be years when the hunting is poor. There will be times when we're both exhausted and cold and questioned everything about the choices we've made. Are you sure you want that? Are you sure you want to choose this life, knowing what it will cost?" Sarah reached up and covered his hand with hers, pressing it against her cheek. "I'm sure," she said, "because what I had before had no cost that was ever worth paying. What I have here, what I have with you, it's worth any price." That night, they made love for the first time. It was neither the violent transactional act that Sarah had feared, nor the awkward fumbling of the inexperienced. Instead, it was a conversation conducted without words, a negotiation of boundaries and desires and comfort. Jonas moved with careful intentionality, checking in with his eyes, responding to the subtle shifts in her body. He treated her as though she was precious, because to him she was. Winter had settled fully over the mountains. Snow covered everything in a thick blanket of white, and the world seemed to have been remade into something pristine and quiet. It was in this setting that they received an unexpected visitor. A man rode up to the cabin on a horse that was near collapse from exhaustion. Jonas recognized him immediately. It was Daniel Walsh, a ranger who patrolled the remote mountain regions and occasionally brought news from the towns below. "Jonas," the ranger said, dismounting stiffly, "I've got news from Dust Valley. That merchant Thorne? He's been arrested. Apparently he's been running a scheme for months, taking people's life savings and then selling them as indentured servants to cover fake debts. The territorial marshal finally caught up with him." Jonas exchanged a look with Sarah. "The marshal is looking for witnesses," Walsh continued. "Specifically, he's looking for the girl he sold. Sarah, I think her name was. They're trying to help the people he defrauded recover their money. If you two come back to Dust Valley, you could testify. It might help a lot of people." Jonas looked at Sarah, letting her make the decision. "Yes," Sarah said after a moment's thought. "I want to go back." The return to Dust Valley was a strange experience. The town seemed smaller now, less intimidating, and that was strange because Sarah had become stronger, but also because the place had simply lost its power over her. She was no longer the girl who could be bought and sold. She was someone who had chosen her own path. They made their way to the marshal's office, where a wiry man with sharp eyes listened to their story. He took careful notes, and then he smiled, a genuine smile of satisfaction. "This is exactly what we needed," he said. "Between your testimony and the records we've confiscated from Thorne, we can start reimbursing the people he defrauded. Some of them have been waiting for this for months." The trial took place a week later. Sarah testified calmly, describing the marketplace auction and the way Thorne had repeatedly misrepresented her background and abilities. She spoke about the debt that had never existed, the price that was supposed to justify her sale. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread through Dust Valley about what had happened, about the mountain man who had paid $100 to stop a sale, about the girl who had disappeared into the wilderness and come back transformed. When Sarah stepped down from the witness stand, she walked back to where Jonas was sitting. He reached out and took her hand, and the simple act seemed to resonate through the courtroom. People stopped talking. Some of them smiled, others simply nodded, as if acknowledging something important. Thorne was convicted. He received 5 years in prison, and restitution was ordered to his victims. It wasn't perfect justice. No legal system could fully compensate for what he had done. But it was something. As they left the courthouse, Sarah paused on the steps and looked back at the town. She thought about the marketplace, about the moment that had seemed like the end of her story, but had instead been a beginning. "Ready to go home?" Jonas asked, using the word deliberately. Not return to the cabin, but go home, as if somewhere in the landscape of rocks and ice and pine trees, they had actually built something worth calling by that name. "Yes," Sarah said, "let's go home." The cabin had changed. An addition had been built onto the side, a second bedroom with a small window that looked out at the mountains. The main room had been expanded, and the shelves that held Jonas's books had been joined by new ones containing Sarah's own volumes, which she had carefully acquired over the past year. But the most significant change was less visible. On a spring morning, with sunlight pouring through the windows and the smell of fresh-baked bread filling the air, Jonas found Sarah at the table, writing in a journal. "What are you working on?" he asked, setting down a fresh cup of tea. "A story," Sarah said, looking up with a smile, "about a girl and a mountain man, about how sometimes salvation looks like the opposite of what you expected, how sometimes the greatest act of love is simply refusing to accept the world's verdict on someone's worth." Jonas read over her shoulder for a moment, then kissed the top of her head. "Will it have a happy ending?" he asked. "It already does," Sarah said, reaching up to take his hand. "Every day is the happy ending. Every moment we wake up in this cabin, in these mountains, free and choosing each other. That's the happy ending." Jonas pulled up a chair and sat beside her. In the afternoon light, they looked like what they had become, not victims of circumstance, but architects of their own redemption. Sarah had filled out, her body no longer marked by the desperation and deprivation of her early years. Her eyes had lost their frightened quality and taken on instead a kind of serene competence. She moved through the world now with the easy grace of someone who knew exactly who she was and exactly what she was capable of. Jonas, for his part, had softened in ways that surprised him. The man who had spent 7 winters alone without human contact had become someone who actively looked forward to conversations. His face, weathered and scarred, had acquired a kind of gentleness when he looked at Sarah, a tenderness that seemed to make the hard lines of his features actually more appealing somehow, like a landscape that had been carved and shaped by time and weather into something beautiful, because of rather than in spite of that weathering. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, setting down her pen, "that we should tell our story to someone. Not to change anything about our lives, but because I think there are people who need to know that sometimes the world gets it wrong. Sometimes the person that the world has written off is exactly the person who was waiting to save you, or to be saved by you, or to meet you somewhere in between." Jonas considered this. "Will you come down to Dust Valley to tell it?" "Only if you come with me," Sarah said. "Only if they see that I didn't end up in the mountains because there was nowhere else for me to go. I ended up in the mountains because that's where I chose to be, with the person I chose to be with. And so that's what they did." The story spread through Dust Valley and beyond, carried by travelers and traders who passed through the town. Some people dismissed it as romantic fancy. Others recognized in it something true about the possibility of redemption, about the way love could operate as a force that reshaped the world according to its own logic. But perhaps the most important audience for the story was not the people who heard about it in towns and settlements throughout the West. Rather, it was the 2 people who lived it, who knew with absolute certainty that it was true. Every morning when they woke in their cabin in the mountains, every evening when they sat together reading, every moment when they worked side by side to maintain their life in that remote and beautiful place, they were living proof that it was possible to reject the world's verdict, to choose each other, to build something new from the ruins of what the old world had tried to destroy. And that, in the end, was enough.